From B Media Production, this is B Podcasting. Engage your audience with podcasts.
Hi, and welcome to episode 6 of season 2. I'm Nick Schildberger. This episode, we hear from an American podcast expert who wrote the book on podcasting, literally, Evo Terra, who gives us his thoughts on where podcasting is heading in the near future and what brands should consider when devising an audio strategy. But before that, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host and podcast aficionado, Chris Ashmore.
G'day, Nick. Yes, huge news coming out recently in the world of podcasting with the launch of Google Podcasts.
Yes, I saw. As
we know, a dedicated app for Android phones. Well, this will result in a massive surge of consumption of podcasts. It's all part of Google's grandiose strategy of doubling worldwide podcast consumption in the next couple of years, they say. Why is this huge? Why should everyone, including your organisation, be taking note? Well, let's move back a bit. Apple only has 15 to 20% of the smartphone share globally, but today Apple's responsible for 60% of all podcast downloads.
How's that possible?
Well, if we focus on 2014, now there was a huge consumption of podcasts back then. A lot of it was attributed to Serial, but in actual fact, it was probably Apple's decision to put the podcast app on their new smartphones. And that increased the exposure to people who had never heard of a podcast before. They're checking out their new iPhone and they want to check out all the little apps and widgets, and they discover this purple icon. So today, with Google now installing a new app, Google Podcasts app on their new Android devices, those with an Android phone who have never really cared much about podcasting will discover, what is this little icon? And they will click on it and discover a new world of podcasting. So it's huge.
In addition to which, people who are searching for content, any content on an Android phone, will automatically have podcasts pop up in their search results. And again, they can click that and it will automatically start playing in this new Google app, whether you've installed it or not.
That's right. And the Google Podcast app is designed for lay people who have never listened to a podcast before. So it's kind of like an on-ramp. It gets them excited about the world of podcasting without it being too technical. Google has close to 85% now of global smartphone penetration. So there's a huge number there. Now will be discovering podcasts. So just to reiterate, if you're a brand or a business or an organisation, what does this mean for you? It means that you need to think about using audio as a strategy, because there's a hell of a lot more people out there now who are listening to podcasts. So do yourself a favour.
No, it's a really good point, Chris, and just great for the industry of podcasting. I think Apple have had it to themselves for quite a while, and now it's great to see Google really stepping up, because competition is going to raise all boats, and more people listening to audio is a great thing.
It's huge, that's right.
But we better move on to today's interview. Who did you speak with?
Evo Terra is a digital marketing expert, radio broadcaster, businessman and leading commentator on podcasting, and he's co-authored Podcasting for Dummies way back in 2005. More recently, though, he's written several articles around podcasting strategy. Now, I asked Evo, who's currently based in Arizona, whether we're still in the early days of podcasting.
Well, this whole thing started in June of 2004, and so now it's 2018, roughly the same time. So we're at the 14-year mark of podcasting. So early days? No. But the great thing is podcasting is a very fungible medium, so I think we're just scratching the surface on what we can do with the types of content that we're putting out in podcasting form. Audio dramas are all the rage now. We're getting a lot more, much more detailed, better production levels in the shows. And so I think we're definitely in the early days of podcasts that are different than just, two dorks with microphones that some of us built our careers around. But I think we're changing away from that.
Well, you're an expert in digital marketing. And what is it about podcasting in particular which is attractive for businesses to get involved with, do you think?
I think right now it might be early days for business podcasting, although there are certainly those who've been at it for a long time. And right now there's that same attraction for businesses about podcasting than that I can remember back in the year 2000, when businesses realized that people were no longer reading the yellow pages, at least here in America, and there was a mad scramble to get launched websites, because that's where people were going to the web to look at their information. And then similarly in 2008, 2009, social media ramped up and businesses looked around and saw that their employees were spending large amounts of time of their day on things like Facebook and Instagram, where people were actually finding new time to consume media, and companies scrambled to get social presences so they could be part of the conversation. And I think that's happening now. Here we are 10 years later. Podcasting's been around for a while, but businesses are realizing that with the advent of not just podcasting, but the ubiquity of mobile devices, the connected car, Alexa, and other smart devices, people are consuming audio in ways that they couldn't do before. And there's a great interest in how can my business become part of that conversation as well.
What do you think businesses should consider if they do think about getting into podcasting before they even start producing a podcast? What do you think they should consider?
Well, obviously, any business that gets into this needs to understand what it is that they're doing. It's great just to get involved, and I recommend anybody who just wants to do it, fine, jump in with both feet. But maybe, if you're a business, be a little more strategic about that and understand the small sliver of podcasting you might have heard or might have heard of is probably not all that there is. So take a larger look back and also look at your business goals. What are the business outcomes that you want to achieve, and how can podcasting help you get there is the question you'll have to answer, or have to find someone who can help you answer.
What are some of the fundamental things that businesses can get wrong when it comes to podcasting?
Well, those fundamental things that they get wrong are the fundamentals. There are a lot of people who are rushing in to get audio recorded without really understanding why they're recording that particular audio, or they're using a quick and dirty service to slam out audio files and an RSS feed and, hey, look, we're podcasting. But there's a lot more to it to that. It goes back to, what are your business outcomes? Are you able to track effectively the people that are listening to your show, how they interact with your show's content, and how do you have a plan of how your show's content connects with all of the other things that you do for your business? This should be part of running your business, unless, of course, your business is running a podcast. But assuming that's not the case, make sure that it all fits nicely together. Don't try to run it as a one-off. It's the same mistake we made with social media back in the day. We gave it to the 20-year-old intern and said, just do something. But now we've grown up around what social media means for businesses, and I think that businesses will quickly grow up and understand what it means to be a business that has a podcast.
Well, let's assume that a business has decided that an audio strategy is the way to go, and they've developed a goal or plan around it. What then, and can you answer this in 2 minutes, what then makes a good podcast? What is a good podcast?
Yeah, a good podcast for businesses does one thing, I think. It tells the story of your business. It becomes that spokesperson. Not the story of how you got started in business, and not the story of your mission and vision statements that you repeat ad nauseum to yourself but nobody ever listens to, but actively can be the voice of your brand telling its story to the world. That's entertaining and of interest to your existing customers, perhaps even to your employees, and most importantly, to your prospective customers. If you have a story that is worthy of being told, and you tell it in a convincing and a clear and a concise and a professional sounding way, then that would make a good podcast for a business.
Now, you wrote an article about having a podcast-first strategy. Can you explain what you mean?
Sure, I can. So I've been doing this podcasting thing since literally the beginning of 2004. And at that time, it was very much a side business for most people, and certainly most businesses that got involved with it. But a lot of things have changed in 14 years. We already know that something over to the tune of 86% of all content is consumed on a mobile device, all podcasting content. And we know pretty much which those podcast applications are doing the consumption. Yet still, when we design a podcast, we listen to it, we think about it in terms of how it works on a regular full-size browser on someone's desktop or laptop. Just like web developers made the switch to mobile first about 5 to 6 years ago, pretty seriously, I think we should start thinking about taking a podcast first strategy, especially for those businesses that have been successful at incorporating podcasting into their business DNA. Instead of making it an afterthought, how does it become the first thing that you think about that can drive customers all the way into and through your marketing funnel, your conversion funnel, those processes, understanding where they come in and how they come out, but making the podcast itself first.
Well, a lot of money is being pumped into podcasting, and that has probably created even better produced podcasts. But what are your thoughts about a company advertising in a podcast? What should they consider there?
Podcasting as an advertisement vehicle can be great as long as you've got a really targeted audience and you understand what audience you're going for, and so does the podcast that you are working with. I think it's a great idea. But the challenges of working with the podcasters is it's almost an all or nothing game. Yes, you can go to the podcasters' clearinghouses, these agencies that represent lots of podcasts, and buy inventory everywhere, but that's kind of the shotgun approach. It's much better, that I've learned through digital advertising in most cases, is to take a much more targeted approach. There are almost 600,000 podcasts listed in the Apple Podcast Directory today, and most of those have no footprint to speak of. So in order to get any sort of sizable numbers for a highly targeted advertisement, you have to advertise on 100 different podcasts. How do you find them? It's a big challenge right now. So people are stepping up to the plate, helping others do podcast advertising, helping them find it, helping them source it, helping them sell it. But we're really in the early days of that, and I'm excited about what prospects are going to be available to people who want to offer their show as inventory, as well as customers who would like to put advertisements on podcasts. There'll be a lot more of that happening in the future.
Now, this brings us on to branded podcasts, and we touched upon that earlier anyway, but what do you think makes a good branded podcast, and do you have any examples perhaps of companies that are doing it well?
There's one I'm listening to right now, which I'm really a big fan of, and it's called Choiceology, and it's a branded podcast by Charles Schwab, a large banking company. Choiceology is great in that it's not trying to sell me Charles Schwab services over and over and over again. It's really good content that's all about the choices people have to make, and since choices are like investments, it's a nice logical flow into the Charles Schwab model. And I think that's what makes a great branded podcast, is when you are able to tell a story that people want to listen to, that relates to your brand, but isn't just beating someone over the head with buy my stuff, buy my stuff, buy my stuff every single week. That's annoying. Make a good, compelling story. Make sure that it sounds great, that people want to listen to it for reasons other than becoming a supporting member or a customer of yours. Make it interesting to the world.
Well, final question, Evo, and if we look at Google, which has stepped up big time with its launch of its dedicated app and its bid to help double the number of podcast listeners in the next couple of years, how do you see the future of podcasting?
Well, I'm very, very bullish on the model. I think we've got a great and bright road ahead of us. There'll be some pitfalls and some setbacks that will come through, some reality checks when the assumption of huge piles of money don't necessarily materialize, and the differences between podcasting and radio continue to show themselves. We'll see new things that are developing over time. Google's move is great. Google has made some tentative and ill-fated moves into podcasting previously, but I'm really excited about the way that they've integrated this new Google Podcast app. It feels very Google to me, the way that it's incorporated, and I do think it will result in a lot more people being exposed to the medium, which hopefully will cause them to have a great time going through and experimenting and trying all the different shows that they can. Because there's a wild world of media out there in podcasting, and I just can't wait for more people to discover it.
Indeed. All of us here too. Evo Terra, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
It was interesting what Evo was saying about the similarities between the take-up of podcasting versus the take-up of social media. And I think there's definitely a scramble at the moment around podcasting. We're seeing inquiry in this business, just increasing week on week, which is great. But I think it's worth highlighting the point that, like with social media a few years ago, when you might just try a few things and test a few things and sort of leave it to the junior in the marketing team, for brands now with podcasting, we've moved beyond that. And I think you've got to be careful if you want to produce a podcast that you produce it at the quality and the in keeping with your brand and the other things that you do in your content marketing.
You got to understand what it's there for, what audio can do for you. So I think we're still a long way from a lot of companies understanding that, though.
But speaking of branded podcasts, which is really what this is all about, Evo raised the point about being careful not to oversell in your podcast. And I believe you have some thoughts on the importance of storytelling in a podcast.
Yeah, there's a statistic I heard recently that particularly a podcasting platform, 80% of their listeners listen to a podcast for education, for self-knowledge, self-education. So using that as an example, providing information or education to an audience, something new that they haven't heard about before, is a great way to draw in a listenership. Now, Evo used Choiceology as an excellent example. So Choiceology is a podcast produced as a branded podcast for Charles Schwab Corporation. And it's all about when intuition fails us and all the psychology about irrational decision-making and how in history certain decisions have been made based on intuition where it's just failed them. What a wonderful topic for a big bank and brokerage firm to put their brand around without, really talking about their services. It draws in the listeners because it's so interesting and people want to learn new stuff.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know what research they did on their audience and what their audience might be interested in before they chose that as the topic of their podcast.
Yeah, well, you need to know what your audience cares about. We've said this before, that you work out what it is that lights their fire, and then build a story around that. And then it links, when they hear it, of course, your brand is associated with what they truly care about. So they're not really, if you're a pen company, they're not really going to care so much about your pens. But what's a story? Perhaps this is just off the top of my head, Nick. Perhaps you could do a podcast on famous speeches written hundreds of years ago or a long time ago that were written down on parchment with a pen. So maybe perhaps the Gettysburg Address, that was written down with a pen. It's not so long. You could do a documentary about that. So your brand is tied with that podcast. I can't think of any other examples, but that'll do for the moment.
No, but I get your point. That would be a really interesting podcast. And if you produce it really well, you make it like a documentary that will draw listeners in and they just won't want to stop listening. And then, by the way, it's brought to you by XYZ Pen Company. Well, you remember that brand.
That's right. And it could open you up to other markets that would not necessarily have heard about you. Build your audience.
It all makes sense. Thank you for the branded podcasting lesson. Well, that's about all we have time for on this episode of Be Podcasting. But for more about us and how we can help you use audio content to build engagement, go to be.com.au. From all of us at Be Media Production, thanks so much for listening.
Be Podcasting is produced by the team at Be Media Production. Managing Director Nick Schildberger, Executive Producer Heather Dawson, Producer Chris Ashmore, and I'm Peter Letts, Director of Audio. For more about us, go to be.com.au.